Hello, my friends. I'm Rick, and this is your seat at the table. And once again, we're talking things BattleTech. We've been looking. I began looking at the what's quoted as the Bandit Kingdoms. So we did the Marian hegemony last time, and I'm going to look at the Cisternus. I can't sure how to pronounce it. Cisternus. Yeah, Circinus Federation. Right. This one I gotta have my copy. Yeah, this is a rare day for me. It's a Monday morning. I don't normally do videos on Mondays. I usually do them on Sundays. Um, I don't work till late this afternoon or early evening today. Kind of an extended weekend after working so much, and I got another month of 6-day weeks coming up again. So, we get them in when we can get them in. All right, so let's take a gander at the Circinus Federation, located outside of the Periphery juncture of the Lyran Commonwealth and the Free Worlds League. Number of worlds 9 as of 3025. Current ruler is C.J. Bob McIntyre. Military strength is 1 regiment. Technology level is 4. Literacy level is fair. After being accused of a contract violation against the Free Worlds League in 2771, the Black Warriors mercenary unit abandoned Merrick's base, narrowly escaping capture by the Free Worlds Navy. Vowing eternal vengeance on House Merrick for their outlawed status, the Black Warriors settled on the planet Circinus. Just bear with me. And joined the pirates already operating there. Colonel Zacharias Sarin, the leader of the Black Warriors, began to support his people through a series of sneak attacks against outlying Merrick agricultural worlds. Both the Star League and Merrick House forces had their hands full with the Amorous crisis, so the Circinus pirates flourished in the absence of reprisals. In 2785, a small convoy of settlers fleeing to destruction in the Lyran Commonwealth landed on the planet to make a new start. Warrior and farmer combined their forces to establish a viable economy and culture. Lyran farmers apparently were never fully aware of the nature of their new allies. The pirates were involved in what remained covert operations, but the farmers asked no questions as long as their allies provided the tools and consumer goods the farmers needed. The pirates, for their part, welcomed the farmers for 2 reasons. First, they provided stability and a possibility of internal law and order without the brutal punishments and intimidation that mark pirate societies elsewhere. That would keep the band of cutlers from turning upon one another. Second, they helped the pirates present the illusion of a respectable agrarian society to neighboring worlds who were their victims. Despite the fact that the Free World's military occupied Cernus during the Law in the Second Succession War, is still most successful bandit kingdom, having long since adapted the presidential system of government. Piracy is a major governmental function, with covert agencies responsible for both the raids themselves and for covering them up. Lyran pundits often note that the citizen's president's chief duty is to look the other way so he will not have to acknowledge the crimes of his government is constantly committing. In recent decades, the inhabitants of Cernus have become cautiously settling neighboring star systems, claiming 8 planets between the years 2990 and 3020. From this new empire, President C.J. Bob McIntyre has entered into a series of joint reconciliation talks with leaders of both interstate governments. Through skillful diplomacy, judicious return of prisoners, and without once admitting any wrongdoing on the part of his people, McIntyre has managed to avert a wholesale counterattack against his federation while playing on the mutual suspicions of his Merrick and Steiner counterparts. McIntyre's position has lately improved with the arrival of numerous mercenary recruits who see him as a Napoleon of the Periphery. Moreover, by convincing both House Merrick and House Steiner that his support could be invaluable, he has managed to acquire shipments of badly needed battle mech spare parts and a small contingent of aerospace fighters. Nevertheless, several McIntyre's lieutenants, yearning for more wealth and power, have challenged his position. Because of the continued infighting between McIntyre and his subordinates, it's uncertain whether the Federation will commit itself to either house. The chief of the officially non-existent pirates is Adam Sarin, the descendant of Zacharias Sarin, founder of the Federation. For the world, Cineris, his 4th position in the system, 7.48 days to the jump points, recharge station none. Comstar Facility B, percentage of level of native life 10%, reptilian. A dry world rich in crystals, gemstones, and radioactive. Cernus is the capital of Circinus Federation. The capital city of Claiborne, remembered, maintains a population just under 10,000 people. Rumors abound of secret bases and training facilities in the northern deserts where it is said the Circins have collected an abundance of material looted from Steiner and Merrick worlds. And we got a couple of personalities in here. Legacy of Charles Merrick. The time many years ago when the Inner Sphere was a relatively peaceful community, people respected each other's rights more or less. If a man killed another, he was hanged for it. In these days, the average Joe scans the facts every day for news of some new slaughter. Farm boys and down and out Mechs blindly obey the orders of smug superiors who squandered the kids' lives by the tens of thousands in the name of some petty warlord. Here and there, so-called patriots support their cause with the same tools as their oppressors and try to vindicate themselves by saying they were fighting for freedom. Sound familiar? We hear a lot of that kind of stuff in our world today. All this continued madness, this self-destructiveness, this decay of civilization has been brought about through the hopes and dreams of those self-righteous, self-involved families who dare call themselves the, quote, Lords of the Star League. What a joke. Most live their petty, luxurious lives in simple stupidity. Or stupid simplicity, letting the average commoner spend his life breaking his back to support their decadence. And should any other lord insult their petty pride, why there's any number of equally petty, greedy generals, admirals, and diplomats frothing at the mouth to send more of their subjects to their doom and retaliation. Behind the frothing generals and the admirals and the rabid diplomats stands the puppet press, proclaiming a greater good at the highest price for human lives, fat on profits they make from the contributions of arms merchants and the literary prostitutes of the universities. And they wonder why we don't want anything to do with their kind. Is it a mystery that we should be so despised of the inner sphere? Why shouldn't we prey on such deceitful, rotting culture? God, I wonder what would happen if the bastards ever gave a war and nobody showed up. From a public forum video featured remarks by Madigan Blaine, Assistant Undersecretary for Diplomatic Affairs to the Circinus Federation, February 14, 2022. There's something poetic about that. So, in a nutshell, typical a lot of the bandit worlds, and they start out small, and this disillusioned group of mercenaries, the Black Warriors, flee their former house employers to the Periphery, and then they set up shop. And the only way to support themselves really is banditry, is to raid and pillage and steal from their neighbors or their betters, depending how you want to look at it. They did so, and then they lucked out. They had some agrarian colonists show up, and instead of traditionally most of these non-pirate populations of these bandit worlds tend to be slaves, people captured in raids and during raids, or people who have escaped that have checkered pasts and histories and are no longer welcome in the greater inner sphere, and so they flee possibly incarceration or death in their home worlds to the beyond and find a new home. Otherwise, they're born there, and thus they're descendants of slaves or nether dwells. You know, and if you look back in history of some of the pirate kingdoms of the Age of Sail comes to mind. Also, some areas of Eastern Africa today, like the Somali pirates and things, comes to mind. They're not doing it necessarily just for the fact that they're greedy and bloodthirsty savages. These are people who are doing what they got to do to survive and to look after their own, and not under some guise of some high and mighty whatever. But enough time passes and with this influx of settlers, they're able to establish a viable economy on their capital, their central world, that allows them to support themselves at the bare minimum level. I mean, it would be cottage industries and farmers and ranchers and hunters, things like this, but there's a sufficient number of them to support stuff other than the true pirate lifestyle. So the pirates are then able to concoct this illusion of respectability by, quote, operating under the table, while above board they portray themselves as defenders of this tiny nascent realm. The realm is successful enough that, as it states, they're able to start settling neighboring worlds that are viable for colonization and have some sort of something on them that makes them economically viable to do so. This isn't common in the inner sphere or in the periphery. For the most part, all through the history of humanity, the biggest share of the colonization efforts took place prior to the Age of War or during the Age of War and prior to the formation of the Star League. And once the Star League forms and then all the succession of wars afterwards, its actual colonization efforts either cease to exist outright or become stagnant. It's very rare for an actual true colony effort to be pushed forward with any kind of support. Now that's made up for by desperate individuals or very future-minded people who think I can do better somewhere else and have the means or take the means to push themselves and some people far enough out of the way from the inner sphere to establish a new colony and hopefully the successful colony. So the Circinus Federation sticks around for quite a while, and while reading up on the particular little bandit kingdom, I went on to Sarnanet Wiki and looked up stuff that they have in there, and of course it carries an updated version carries it up through the modern battle mech era. So at the Federation hangs in there, and it's moderately successful for quite a long time, and then they hook up with the Word of Blake, and like a lot of entities after the Jihad and the Dark Age, it costs them. Basically, as a federation, as a kingdom, they're dissolved. They fall apart, partially destroyed by the enemies of the Word of Blake. They championed or backed the wrong horse and paid for it. This is also a common thread through a lot of these petty little kingdoms that pop up around for a while, then at some point they either dissolve from internal conflict, a lack of the ability, they're cut off and they have no ability to support themselves in the critical areas that cause them to fail, or an outside entity crushes them, eliminates them. And dozens of years later, 100 years later, another group of people come along and establish a new colony on this, because the worlds don't go away. The worlds are still viable unless they're totally destroyed. I believe in the case of the Circinus that some inner sphere power basically nukes or chemically bombs the crap out of the planet and destroys it, and we're trying to knock out Word of Blake. Now, I may be wrong on my facts on that, so you take that with a pound of salt and go do your own research on it, but that's how they play out. There's a couple of things though that while reading up on these bandit kingdoms and reestablishing my connection with this part of the periphery, got my mind churning a little bit. Let's talk about the apex of military hardware in Battletech, the Mech. The fact that the Mechs are force multipliers and game changers in land combat is not disputed. Majority of the inner sphere, the large houses, have manufacturing capacity. They have factories, and I never did an actual head count on it, but I think the Mech factories number in or around 100, roughly around 100. If somebody else has a better number on that, by all means chime in and let's get a discussion going on it, because it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting topic to explore and to dig into. So just like jump ship production, there's only about a dozen or so fleet yards that are available to produce new jump ships. Probably a few more, a couple more dozen yards that are capable of maintenance and repair of jump ships. So when it comes to battle mechs, having actually brand new mechs is not outside impossibility for these many outside outflung organizations and bandit kingdoms and independents and so on and so forth, but they would be hideously expensive and very difficult to acquire, and then to happen to get them from the factories that they get them from or the brokers they buy them from in the inner sphere to their periphery location makes it even more unlikely and difficult and expensive that they're going to arrive. So what we have is most of the hand downs, cast outs, and captured spoils of the inferior militaries that end up in these periphery kingdoms and periphery independence. And a lot of these mechs are going to be ancient, abused, heavily repaired. There's the other thing. How do you go about if you're a small bandit kingdom that wants to find legitimacy? You need to have a viable economic base to keep your population going, but you also have to have some kind of industrial base. The more successful periphery powers, the Turian Concordat, Majesty of Canopus, for example, Outwards Alliance, they have manufacturing facilities. They have a handful of those extremely rare factories that produce mechs and aerospace fighters in small numbers, sufficient numbers to support their attrition needs and to very minutely expand their military forces, because that's the same problem the inner sphere has. The inner sphere, any great house can support X amount of military forces, and there seems to be an underwritten cap as to how big they can how much they can support, because the manufacturing capacity producing potentially 400 or 500 mechs a year for House Davion, for example, well, that's enough to field 3 or 4 new battle mech regiments every year, except attrition takes its toll. Attrition and destruction means you need to replace the equipment that you got. And if you're going to stay viable, you need to replace the aging equipment you got. That's another common thread that sometimes gets brushed under the table by a lot of newer players when it comes to Battletech, is the longevity of the technology and just how resilient a lot of this stuff is. It's not unheard of, just like jump ships, to be hundreds of years old, to find mechs that are hundreds of years old or dozens and scores of years old, and actually been handed down from one family member to another as kind of a stable for their house, their family fortune. And the loss of that's why becoming dispossessed for many mech warriors is so catastrophic. There's an emotional attachment to it. There's this sense of self and well-being attached to the ownership of their mech or having access to a mech, and then there's the economic difference. A family who has 1 or 2 or a small stable of mechs that can operate in the greater house is going to see a bigger revenue stream. Obviously, mech warriors get paid better than tank commanders. I'm just tossing that out there. So, in absence of all the factories, and what is the periphery powers or the minor periphery powers and would-be powers resort to? Well, like I said, first is getting it from their neighbors, taking somebody else's mechs, preferably intact as possible. Second is parts. You get as many parts as you can from any sources you can, and you kit bash your own mechs. Generally speaking, if you can get all the components of a mech, you can assemble one. We can do that with cars today, and we do that. Generally speaking, we don't make a Frankenstein car. I mean, there are people who do just that. I mean, you put together whatever you got to make that thing functionable. But for the everyday, everyday use in modern society, that's not going to be acceptable. But I was out at a customer last week that is very sporadic. The owners, they have to be forced by the city to service their grease trap and get their hoods cleaned. Eventually, they're going to have a horrific fire there or a breakout of something, and the health department will shut them down. But in the basement of the strip mall that the restaurant's at, which is also where the grease trap is this what looks like a chop shop. And I've been in there a few times over the last 5 years to service their grease trap. And so at any given time, there's a dozen or so high-end vehicles. I saw a Cadillac and a Lexus and several Volvos and a Mercedes down there in various parts of being reassembled or disassembled. And they were bringing in the front clip of a Lexus, brand new, still, so all wrapped up in plastic from the factory when I came down there. So I mean, they're buying these things used and beat up, damaged, and then refurbishing them, and then probably reselling them as not salvaged vehicle at some lot somewhere that they own or have some kind of connection with. So the same thing would apply to a lot of these smaller periphery powers. This also applies to the greater houses in general too. A mech repair bay is a extremely valuable resource. It's a necessity to keep your mechs not only to repair battle damage, but just to maintain them properly and keep them functioning. You have to have the equipment and more important, the knowledge to do this. So if any kind of bandit kingdom wants to really have a chance of being successful, they're not just going to acquire mechs and steal them or buy them and buy the parts. They're gonna salvage, viciously salvage everything they can. There's a rumor of a mech that was shot up and it's leading in the desert somewhere, some frontier world nobody ever goes to. You can bet somebody somewhere is going to make an effort to go get it, and maybe more than one someone's. And I've actually run some mini campaigns where that's the gist of it. Two opposing forces are all seeking a small stockpile of damaged machinery, and you want to capture the stockpile, and you want to capture it without completely devastating your force, because obviously if you lose more machines and material and men than what the prize is worth, then it's a horrific victory at best and a total loss at worst. So they're going to want to acquire technicians, machinists, specialists, people who can repair these things and refurbish these things and perhaps even build these things. So you're going to create a shop someplace. A lot of mercenary forces, a lot of houses. That's what their drop ships double down as. You have a drop ship. It has the gantries and the cranes and all the heavy lift equipment and a lot of the finer tuned machinery to allow them to do repairs in the field. This is very crucial. We see this in the Grey Death Saga book, especially in the early days, just how crucial and how bad a loss of a drop ship can be if they can't access the parts and more importantly the technical personnel that are staffing it. And so the Circinus Federation, Marian Hegemony, a dozen other little bandit kingdoms and would-be pirate lords and so on and so forth are going to have some kind of mech base someplace, even if it's just a crude slapdash sheet metal walled building sticking in at the edge of some crappy little port. It's going to need some people that can do this stuff and the equipment to do it. So the better equipped there are, the more machinery they have, the better off they are. So if you think about it for a moment, just how many thousands of components and parts make up the average battle mech? Even the smallest of mechs is still a force multiplier. A single locust in the hands of a competent pilot on any world is going to dominate the battlefield of infantry and tanks and stuff to a point. Obviously, heavy and medium heavy tanks are going to take out that locust. Well-trained sappers are going to take out that. They're going to blow the legs off that locust or bring it down. But as a ton per ton, that locust is worth more than probably twice its tonnage in conventional vehicles and infantry. So they're going to need these people. They're going to beg, borrow, steal. So one of those raids, several of those raids on bigger intersphere targets might include a mech repair facility someplace where they can try to not only get parts and steal mechs and parts, but potentially take captive the technical expertise. The other half that would be some of these, like everybody else, some technical engineer or battle mechanic in the intersphere gets in trouble, has a bar fight that he loses or wins in a nefarious way, or has bad gambling debts, or runs afoul of his commanding officers because he's dallying with his wife or daughter or something, has to flee for his life, runs off and joins the pirates, and then the pirates discover he's got some skills and he's going to get a better payout, a better share because he's extremely valuable. So that's just my thoughts on the subject of how these guys not only maintain but potentially manufacture their own mechs on a limited basis. So the longer that a quote bandit kingdom exists, and the more resources they're able to bring in, the more important that's going to be. So in the case of the Circinus Federation, for example, it's established that a large contingent of farmers show up. Now these farmers are going to need technology to farm and do what they do. So the possibilities of putting together some kind of facility that can assemble and maintain and repair agromechs, for example, well, that's a natural conduit for assembling and repairing battle mechs. Also a natural conduit for pilots that you learn, and the farm boys learn how to run those agromechs, can easily operate a battle mech. Just going to need some more polishing and training to be good at being a mech warrior. So this is also covered in books like the Great Death Saga and stuff like this. And without them, most of these little bandit kingdoms wouldn't amount to much. You don't necessarily need to have mechs, to be raiding your neighbors. Matter of fact, in some aspects, in some locations, mechs can probably be a hindrance, and they're a really expensive component. Obviously, a couple drop ships full of light tanks and heavily armed gutter gang infantry could raid a warehouse for food supplies or commercial supplies or commerce locations. Just like they can space jack and jump ships and drop ships into space. You don't use mechs for that sort of thing. But sooner or later, you're going to run up against somebody who has them, and just the ability to defend yourself, to escape, may be crucial. It's a balancing act. And of course, it's also that force projection thing. We're back to that status symbol, or that, the fact that the Circinus Federation can field an entire regiment of mechs, and fairly well competent piloted mechs, is impressive for such a tiny little organization, for such a tiny community. And it lends itself to their longevity. So not only do they have the ability to project force out against their rivals and neighbors to acquire materials and things that they need by force, they have the ability to defend their own turf from significant sized forces that might come against them. Of course, if a true house wanted to crush them, they would send enough force out there to, 5-to-1, to send 5 regimental combat teams out there, and the damn thing's done. See, so that's another downside or danger for these little pocket kingdoms on the edges of the periphery. Once they start to develop, so the McIntyre and his cronies have managed to settle 7 other worlds. They didn't take them by force. They did. And the Marian hegemony is increasing in size in part because they're trying to absorb other small neighboring nation states. Just like if the Circinus Federation was close enough, they might be in conflict because the Marian hegemony might at some point try to assimilate them, take them over. So you get enough, you expand it up, and you grow just big enough. At that point, you start really catching the eye of your more powerful nearest neighbors. And in some of them are going to be looking at you as a bigger threat, and maybe that you need to be knocked down a few pegs or put on your back. Others are going to be looking at you as a viable resource to exploit and to acquire. And that becomes a dangerous thing unto itself. So it's once again, it's another balancing act within itself. That they survive as long as they do is a testament to luck, skill, determination, and mostly luck. All right. Anyway, this is Rick. Until next time, hope you guys have a great weekend.